Today we're going to disembowel L. Ron Hubbard's quote about the aims of Scientology.
A civilization without insanity, without criminals, and without war, where the able can prosper, and honest beings can have rights, and where man is free to rise to greater heights, are the aims of Scientology.
In L. Ron Hubbard's utopian vision, Scientology claims to create a civilization without insanity, without criminals, and without war, where the able can prosper and honest beings can have rights, and where man is free to rise to greater heights. But the reality of Scientology's practices reveals a chilling departure from this vision. What Hubbard promised is a mirage, masking an organization driven not by a mission to uplift humanity, but by a relentless pursuit of control, profit, and secrecy. When L. Ron Hubbard declared that Scientology's goal was to create a civilization without insanity, it might have sounded like a noble pursuit. But, peeling back the layers of Scientology's actual practices and stances reveals a chilling contradiction. While Scientology claims to aim for a world free from mental illness, it actively opposes mainstream psychiatric practices and mental health care.
CCHR Florida has several thousand members. We're going to activate these guys. Hundreds of CCHR members gathered together and marched to a psychiatric conference and demonstrated. We were protesting the drugging of children. We were protesting the abuses in the mental health law. And I made it known to these lawmakers that this is what we did.
Leaving those within its grasp vulnerable and untreated. Nowhere is this more evident than in its vehement opposition to psychiatry, embodied by the Church's Citizens Commission on Human Rights, CCHR, a powerful anti-psychiatry group fueled by rhetoric against accepted mental health treatments. Through CCHR, Scientology has long campaigned against psychiatry, deeming it harmful, fraudulent, and even criminal. Scientologists are discouraged, often barred, from seeking psychiatric help or taking prescribed medication, with devastating consequences. They believe that mental illness is not a clinical issue but a matter of spiritual failings or engrams, traumatic experiences imprinted on the mind, which Scientology claims only their teachings can erase. This stance has directly contributed to multiple tragedies, where members in need of mental health care were deprived of it and met with dire consequences. Consider the case of Ellie Perkins, a devoted Scientologist and mother, who believed her son's schizophrenia could be managed through Scientology practices instead of psychiatric care. Ellie was urged by her church to avoid mainstream treatments. Tragically, in 2003, her son, untreated for his severe mental illness, fatally attacked her. This horrific event is not an isolated incident but part of a pattern. Scientology's blanket dismissal of psychiatry as a criminal industry has often left its members with no avenue for relief, leading to tragic outcomes for individuals and families alike. Similarly, Whitney Mills, another devoted Scientologist, was discouraged from seeking mental health support outside of Scientology's structure. Suffering from a mental breakdown, she turned to her church for help but was denied the necessary psychiatric care, ultimately resulting in her tragic death in 2018. Whitney's story underscores how Scientology's policies do not foster a civilization free from insanity but rather allow untreated mental health issues to spiral unchecked. The case of Lisa McPherson may be one of the most notorious examples. She sought Scientology's help during a mental health crisis, only to be subjected to what the church calls the introspection rundown, a method purported to help individuals confront and rid themselves of unwanted feelings. For 17 days, Lisa was isolated and denied proper medical care. She died of a pulmonary embolism, dehydrated and neglected. Her case represents the tragic culmination of Scientology's opposition to psychiatric intervention, an opposition that, in Lisa's case, was fatal. Hubbard's proclamation of a civilization without insanity rings hollow when the very organization he founded discourages its followers from accessing legitimate mental health treatment. By waging a war against psychiatry and instead enforcing pseudoscientific practices that reject medical consensus, Scientology has not created a world free from mental illness but one that denies help to those suffering most. Far from fostering a sanctuary, its practices have often led to suffering, isolation, and, tragically, death. L. Ron Hubbard's proclamation of a Scientology utopia without criminals couldn't be more hypocritical when contrasted with the Church's actual track record. Despite its claims to promote ethics and justice, Scientology has repeatedly shown a disturbing pattern of shielding abusers within its ranks, silencing victims, and protecting its image at all costs. Nowhere is this contradiction more glaring than in the recent high-profile case of actor and Scientologist Danny Masterson. Masterson's years of sexual abuse, a horror known to the Church since the early 2000s, was not only ignored but actively covered up. When victims first came forward to Scientology about Masterson's abuse nearly 2 decades ago, they hoped for support and justice. But rather than reporting the crimes to authorities, Scientology insisted the victims keep quiet, pressuring them to resolve the matter internally to avoid scandal. The Church is notorious for handling such issues through its ethics officers, who discourage members from involving outside authorities and punish those who dare to violate church secrecy. In a stunning example of Scientology's willingness to silence victims, the Church enlisted Lisa Marie Presley, a prominent Scientologist and the daughter of Elvis Presley, to pressure Masterson's victims into silence. Presley later expressed deep regret over her role in pressuring these women and went public with her remorse just before her death. For years, the Church used Presley's influence to keep victims quiet, and it wasn't until 2020, decades after they initially notified the Church, that the women publicly broke their silence and pursued justice in the courts. When these women came forward, Scientology forced their members and the family of the victims to disconnect from the women. Scientology claims that this disconnection is a choice of its members, but the choice is bounded. Should a member choose not to disconnect, they themselves will suffer this same disconnection policy. The Church's pattern of protecting abusers isn't new or limited to high-profile members. Miriam Francis's story reveals yet another disturbing example. As a child, Miriam was subjected to abuse by her own father, a devoted Scientologist. When church officials learned of the abuse, they again chose to protect the abuser rather than the victim. Instead of notifying law enforcement, Scientology used its funds to fly both Miriam and her father out of the country, thus shielding him from U.S. prosecution and abandoning Miriam without the support or justice she deserved. This case exposes Scientology's appalling priorities, protecting abusers while victimizing those who dare to speak out. In each of these cases, Scientology has demonstrated its willingness to protect its own, even at the expense of justice. Victims who speak out are branded as suppressive persons and often subjected to harassment, isolation, and expulsion from the Church. Internal Scientology documents reveal that anyone who goes to law enforcement, even in cases of criminal behavior, is treated as a threat to the Church, punished, and ostracized. By demonizing those who seek justice and defending the abusers who harm them, Scientology actively perpetuates a culture of fear, intimidation, and cover-ups. Hubbard's vision of a world without criminals is nothing more than a hollow promise. Scientology does not merely fail to uphold this ideal, it actively undermines it by shielding abusers, discouraging victims, and silencing anyone who challenges the Church's image. This isn't a civilization without criminals, but rather an organization built on lies and hypocrisy, one that protects criminals within its own walls while abandoning their victims to suffer in silence. Among Scientology's many lofty promises is its supposed mission to bring about a world without war. L. Ron Hubbard once claimed that Scientology's core purpose was to eradicate the causes of war, to bring peace to humanity. However, since its founding in 1953, Scientology has not only failed to make any meaningful strides toward ending conflict, but has also proven entirely ineffectual in even attempting to contribute to peace efforts. If Scientology truly sought to fulfill its claim of eradicating war, there would be some record of its involvement in global peace initiatives or mediating conflicts. Yet, Scientology's legacy tells a different story. In over 70 years of existence, the organization has largely confined itself to self-promotion, focusing on increasing its own influence rather than making any tangible efforts to end real-world violence or unrest. Consider the conflicts that continue to rage across the globe today. The Israel-Palestine conflict, a decades-long struggle, with no sign of Scientology playing any role in attempting to mediate or offer solutions to one of the most protracted conflicts in modern history. The war in Ukraine. Since 2014, tensions and violence have escalated between Ukraine and Russia, culminating in a full-scale war in 2022. Scientology's presence? Non-existent. While international aid organizations, diplomats, and even religious groups from various faiths have worked to address the humanitarian crisis, Scientology has remained silent. The Syrian civil war, ongoing since 2011, with millions displaced and thousands killed, this brutal conflict is yet another glaring example of a war that Scientology has ignored, despite its supposed commitment to a peaceful civilization. Conflicts in Yemen, Sudan, and Myanmar, these humanitarian crises have plagued millions, with global outcry and involvement from peacekeeping and relief organizations. Yet Scientology remains absent from any meaningful intervention. Hubbard's declaration of creating a civilization without war has proven to be nothing more than wishful rhetoric, a claim that is useful for public relations but has no basis in reality. Scientology's teachings, rooted in Dianetics and Hubbard's personal philosophies, do not include peacekeeping or conflict resolution strategies. Instead, the Church's resources have been spent on expansion, legal battles to protect its own tax-exempt status, and defending itself against criticism. Scientology's focus has always been inward, directed at strengthening its own structures and holding onto its adherents, not outward toward bettering society. While organizations worldwide dedicate resources and personnel to peace initiatives, humanitarian aid, and conflict resolution, Scientology has consistently prioritized its own image and financial growth. The claim to be building a civilization without war is not only false but deeply misleading. Scientology has shown no desire, and even less ability, to address the challenges of war. In truth, it has not contributed a single step toward ending global conflicts, bringing peace to war-torn regions, or alleviating suffering for those affected by violence. In a world where countless organizations strive to end conflict and foster peace, Scientology stands apart, self-absorbed, silent, and disengaged from the very mission it claims as its reason for being. Far from working to create a world without war, Scientology appears to exist only to expand its own influence, leading the world no closer to peace. When Scientology claims to create a world where the able can prosper, it's not a universal promise. Hidden within this phrase is a stark message of exclusivity. Scientology exists not to lift up all of humanity, but to make the able more able.
Scientology is for an able guy like you, or like me, able to function in life, able to make his own way, does his work, and so forth. All right, that's the man that should be helped. That's the man you should help out, because that fellow is having a hard time.
In its mission to empower the so-called elite, Scientology reveals itself as a deeply elitist organization that actively disregards, and even excludes, those who do not fit its narrow definition of able. Those struggling with disabilities, poverty, or life's basic hardships often find themselves on the outside looking in, as Scientology shows no interest in aiding society's most vulnerable. Scientology's doctrine doesn't offer a hand up to those in need, but rather focuses on fortifying a self-selected upper crust of able individuals. The organization's history reflects this exclusivity. Under L. Ron Hubbard's direction, Scientology made no effort to help those facing homelessness, poverty, or disability. Instead, it concentrated on those it considered able-bodied, high-achieving, and financially capable of affording its costly courses. In Scientology's eyes, the able are the only ones worthy of their teachings and resources, a troubling stance that has persisted throughout its existence. One need look no further than the story of Tori Chrisman to see the Church's disdain for anyone it perceives as less able. Chrisman, a devoted Scientologist for over 3 decades, joined Scientology's internal paramilitary organization, the Sea Organization, Sea Org. But when Scientology learned that Chrisman suffered from epilepsy, she was swiftly cast out of the Sea Org. Her epilepsy, a manageable condition, was deemed incompatible with their vision of an able member. Rather than accommodate her needs, the Church's response was to exclude her, treating her medical condition as a barrier to her inclusion in their so-called elite organization. Chrisman's experience exposes Scientology's intolerance toward those who don't fit its rigid standards. For Scientology, a condition like epilepsy is reason enough to exclude someone, even if that person is a dedicated member. This elitist philosophy isn't limited to disabilities alone. Scientology offers no programs or outreach to aid the homeless, the hungry, or those grappling with life's most basic needs. The organization's emphasis is squarely on wealth and self-perfection. Those who cannot pay for its expensive courses and audits are left to fend for themselves. Rather than extending its resources to uplift society's downtrodden, Scientology's attention is devoted solely to those it believes are already positioned to prosper. Ironically, Scientology's own treatment of its members contradicts its promise of making the able more able. For Tori Chrisman, the breaking point came not only because of her exclusion over epilepsy but also her realization that Scientology actively suppresses free speech, preventing members from questioning its doctrines. Over the years, Chrisman saw firsthand how Scientology's oppressive control over thought stifles individual prosperity. Eventually, she left Scientology and now speaks out against the organization, warning others of its exclusionary, repressive practices. In truth, Scientology has never served as a force for universal prosperity. Instead, it has established itself as an elitist organization that only caters to the wealthy, healthy, and compliant. Its claim to create a world where the able can prosper is not a promise of opportunity for all, but a declaration that only a select few are worth its time. By shutting its doors to those in need and silencing members who speak up, Scientology shows its true colors, a society built for the few, not the many. Scientology's claim to create a world where honest beings can have rights stands as one of its most brazen hypocrisies. Beneath the church's polished exterior lies a culture of calculated deception, woven through its doctrines and enforced in its practices. Far from fostering honesty, Scientology has institutionalized dishonesty as a tool to control its members, manipulate the public, and preserve its image at any cost. In Scientology's world, honesty is reserved for the naive, while deceit is not only accepted but encouraged as a means to further its agenda. Central to Scientology's doctrine is L. Ron Hubbard's statement, "The only way to control people is to lie to them." This chilling mantra reflects a core tenet of Scientology, that manipulation and deception are essential tools in maintaining control over both followers and critics. The organization's tactics revolve around this belief, with members routinely instructed to bend the truth, or abandon it altogether, in the service of Scientology's objectives. Honesty is not a virtue in Scientology but a liability that must be suppressed or selectively applied, depending on what benefits the organization. Supporting this policy of deception are the doctrines of acceptable truths and sure stories. Acceptable truths refers to the practice of telling half-truths or convenient lies when it serves Scientology's interests. Rather than striving for genuine transparency, Scientology teaches its members that it is perfectly acceptable to fabricate or distort the truth if doing so will protect the church's image. For example, when confronted with criticism or questions from outsiders, Scientologists are often coached to offer sanitized, pre-approved answers designed to obscure the church's more controversial practices. In Scientology's view, honesty is irrelevant if a carefully crafted lie will better serve their purpose. The concept of sure stories goes even further, instructing Scientologists to create entire narratives to mislead the public about their true intentions. A sure story is a false backstory devised to explain away the church's actions in a way that appears innocuous to outsiders. In Scientology, deception is not just tolerated, it's codified as an essential practice, enabling the church to operate under a veil of secrecy while projecting an illusion of integrity. These doctrines reveal a dark irony in Scientology's promise to uphold the rights of honest beings. In reality, Scientology shows nothing but contempt for honesty. Members are taught to lie to outsiders, to deceive critics, and even to obscure the truth from one another, all in the name of preserving the church's reputation. There is no room for transparency in a system where lying is seen as a necessary means of control, and truth is malleable, manipulated to suit the church's needs. For Scientologists, the right to honesty, the ability to speak openly and truthfully, is systematically stripped away. Followers are expected to accept and perpetuate lies, to put aside their personal integrity in favor of Scientology's manufactured truth. And those who dare to question or challenge this policy often find themselves labeled as suppressive persons, isolated from family, friends, and the very rights that Scientology claims to protect. The Church's so-called commitment to honesty is nothing more than a facade, hiding a system where lies are mandatory and truth is a dangerous liability. In Scientology's world, honest beings do not have rights. Instead, they are indoctrinated into a culture of deception, where lies are a tool for control and acceptable truths are the currency of power. The organization's promise to create a civilization built on honesty is, in fact, its greatest deception, one that conceals a relentless commitment to manipulation and concealment. Scientology's lofty promises crumble under scrutiny. Its war on mental health care, an unyielding stance that denies members proper medical treatment, has left tragedy in its wake, harming countless lives. The Church's claim to rid society of criminals is contradicted by its history of protecting abusers within its ranks, even when victims, often members themselves, sought justice. And despite its supposed mission to bring peace to humanity, Scientology has never lifted a finger toward ending global conflict, instead focusing its resources on expanding its influence and shielding its secrets. Its promise to create a world where the able can prosper is, at its core, a statement of elitism, excluding those who don't meet its rigid, self-serving definition of ability. Those with disabilities, those facing hardship, those unable to pay the Church's hefty fees, they are not included in Scientology's world. And the supposed rights of honest beings? A cruel irony in a culture that has institutionalized deception, urging members to manipulate outsiders and bury truths to protect Scientology's image. In reality, Scientology's ideal civilization is one where conformity is enforced, dissent is punished, and the Church's authority remains unquestioned. It is a civilization where control and secrecy triumph over compassion and integrity. The values it purports to champion, sanity, honesty, justice, and freedom, are undermined at every turn by its own policies and actions. Rather than freeing humanity to rise to greater heights, Scientology has proven itself to be an organization mired in hypocrisy, where true freedom, compassion, and honesty are sacrificed for the preservation of a self-serving doctrine. Scientology's vision may sound noble on paper, but in practice, it is an empty promise, a hollow edifice built on the very contradictions it claims to oppose. For anyone seeking a society founded on true principles of empathy, justice, and truth, Scientology offers nothing but an illusion, a sham, and a grave reminder that words alone do not make a civilization.
Follow us on YouTube at Windy City Thetan Watch. We do live protests, studio panels, and curated videos.